do you seem so scared? All I wanted to do was play with you. Please come and play with me. I am so lonely. You're not afraid of the dark, are you? Don't be afraid. Come with me. I will show you where I play hide and seek. Do you want to play hide and seek? You hide, and I'll find you.
It just wasn't their night. That was how serial killer Richard Speck summed up the incident that would mark him indelibly in the annals of crime in the United States. It would come to be known as the Townhouse Murders. 8 women would die that night. How and why Speck would be driven to carry out such a brutal act of misogyny has its seeds in his upbringing. He would come to regard women as nothing but whores, whether they walked the streets as sex workers or not. To Speck, they were all tainted, disposable, and worth little. He saw them as human garbage that he was more than happy to dispense with. The 8 women who died at his hand did not doubt for a moment that they were dealt a fatal blow by a human monster. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on the 6th of December 1941. He was the youngest of 8 children, and born several years after the eldest. His father, Benjamin, was a warehouse packer, consistent with his long career in manual labor. Richard was often socially isolated due to the significant generational gap between him and his next oldest sibling. He had only his mother for company until his sister Carolyn was born 2 years later. Richard's mother, Mary Margaret Speck, was a devoutly religious woman and lived the typically ascetic lifestyle that is common among religious conservatives. His father was also a person of faith, and Richard often sought to emulate him in every way. Richard felt more comfortable in the company of his father. His mother was overbearing with her cloying attention. She smothered Richard and turned him away as a result. Richard and his father were kindred spirits. Their affection was articulated between the lines and felt rather than spoken. Benjamin hadn't been as close to the other kids, which annoyed Mary. For some reason, Richard was a little extra special to Benjamin. The eldest children began to flee the nest, and Mary was distressed by this development. She mollycoddled them, hoping to infantilize them so that they would become dependent on her and opt to remain with her. Richard Speck's first struggles with those in the outside world began once he started elementary school. Though he was quiet and polite, he appeared to have a learning disability and an inability to remain focused on his work. After rearranging his seating position in class, his teacher realized that he needed glasses. His parents bought him glasses, but he refused to wear them except under strict orders from his father. Benjamin noticed that the glasses made Richard uncomfortable. Carrying forth his father's example, he saw the glasses as an advertisement for weakness and imperfection. He wanted to be stoic like his father. Richard's glasses drew attention from the other children, which he loathed. He felt uncomfortable in the spotlight and wished to remain inconspicuous. The school teacher forced him to stand up and read in front of the class. This he resented a great deal. She would be the first woman he would blame for his problems. This wasn't where his problems ended. His father had a heart attack at work and died in hospital. He was closer to his father than he had been to any other person in his life, and now his rock was gone. The mourning period stretched over the next 3 years. As if attempting to draw Benjamin's spirit back from the afterlife, Richard clung to every memory and memento that remained of the person he loved most. Simultaneously, his feelings for the women in his life continued to sour. He resented the way that the women in his life micromanaged his every movement. This, as they went on with their lives, nearly forgetting Benjamin entirely. Richard would never forget him. His behavior at school became even more problematic. He fell behind academically due to his refusal to read aloud and wear his glasses. His resentment toward his teachers mutated from passive-aggressive insolence to pig-headed indolence. He would often refuse to do his work purely out of spite. He had become a problem child, and there was little opportunity for him to develop his skills in socializing with outsiders, since he rarely left his family's home. Another setback in Richard's recovery from his father's death occurred when he was 9 years old. As his mother made her way back from a trip to Chicago, she met a man on the train named Carl Lindbergh. He couldn't have been more unlike Benjamin Speck. He was a silver-tongued traveling salesman who just as effectively sold himself as a sexual prospect to women. He sure had Mary convinced of his worth. Another way in which Carl was incomparable to Benjamin was that he was a prodigious drinker and an inveterate smoker. Though Mary normally frowned upon such habits, she was so taken with Carl that she invited him to meet her family once at home. It was there where Carl pitched himself as a paternal figure for their children. The older children were sold. Even shy Carolyn was taken in by his charms. Richard was the exception. He kept Carl at a distance from day one. He tried to wear Carl down in a staring contest, but all he could do was squint. Carl soon realized Richard was a lost cause and gave up all hopes of winning him over. At this point, Mary was smitten, but Richard's loyalty lay with his father. He felt betrayed by her. His relationship with his eldest sister, Sarah, disintegrated under this new circumstance. As their mother was busy being courted by Carl, Sarah did her utmost to care for her younger siblings. Richard did not honor her authority and came to see her influence on the household, and on him in particular, as oppressive. Mary and Sarah were the only grown-ups in his life that he loved. Their endeavor to replace Benjamin with Carl bore fruit as Richard's love for them fermented. Another event that drenched the embers of Richard's resentment with gasoline occurred in May of 1950. The family took a train ride to Palo Pinto, Texas, and the children were instructed to wear their Sunday finest, as they would go to any church. Only this was no ordinary church service. With no advance warning to Richard, his mother married Carl before his eyes. Richard was nauseated by the proceedings, and when the minister asked if anybody objected to the union, Richard's only response was the bile that blasted up into his throat. He was still too shy to stand up in front of people and speak, but that didn't mean he was at a loss for words. He was dying to scream his curses at his mother for what he deemed to be a betrayal. Instead, he sat in silence and wiped tears of frustration from his face. As if this knife in Richard's back hadn't been excruciating enough, Carl and Mary twisted the blade when Carl adopted all of Mary's children. It was an adjunct to the ceremony. Now he had replaced Benjamin legally. Mary hadn't consulted Richard or any of the other children about her decision. Carl hadn't merely been integrated into Richard's life. He was forced onto him. This Richard could not forgive. He couldn't stand being addressed as Richard Lindbergh. As far as he was concerned, it was a misnomer. The very sight of Carl was enough to fill Richard with barely manageable rage. The family made plans to move to where Carl was living at the end of the school year. They hoped that the time spent away from Carl would alleviate Richard's depression and resentment, but it didn't. Normally, Carolyn could lift Richard out of his misery, but even she wasn't up to the task this time around. The only monument left to his father's legacy was the house, and he even stood to lose that. A downward spiral began that started with Richard's lackluster performance in school. He became truant, and when he did attend, he didn't do his work and didn't socialize with his alumni. He wouldn't even acknowledge when his teachers spoke to him. Knowing that he was moving out of state and that he was likely affected by the loss of his father, he was merely given a black mark on his scholastic record. Richard anticipated life in Carl Lindbergh's home with dread. Once everybody was settled, Carl let his guard down and exposed the side of him that the public and Mary would normally never have seen. He would begin by removing the peg he wore in place of one of his shins when the Texas heat became overwhelming for him. His vices of drinking and smoking proved to be much more of an addiction than Mary had realized. Mary struggled to keep the house tidy, with all the empty whiskey bottles lying on every available surface. There was an ashtray in every room, and it was stuffed to the rim with butts. The house reeked of stale tobacco. Richard could barely tolerate either the look of Carl or the stench of him. Though Carl earned more money than Benjamin had, he squandered most of his money on liquor and cigarettes. Mary was an old-fashioned wife who never complained about these shortcomings. If his personal habits and inept financial management were the worst aspects of his character, it would have been easy for the rest of the family to look the other way. The trouble was, there was a dark side to Carl Mary hadn't bargained for, whether in the stories she heard from neighbors or from Carl's own mouth during his drunken stupors. A profile of a man with a criminal history took shape. His charges included forgery as well as drinking and driving. This hardly came as a shock to Richard, who already regarded Carl as little more than a phony and a drunkard. It wasn't obvious to Mary at first. She thought she had given herself and her family a better life. The truth was, Carl was a skilled manipulator. As a romantic prospect, he had proven to be a snake oil salesman. For the most part, Carl had been kind and generous, particularly to Mary and Carolyn. His treatment of Richard was completely different. He knew Richard disliked him, and he became vindictive. He began with criticisms and unsolicited advice. From this, he graduated to more biting remarks and outright insults. He kept a lid on it so that he wouldn't say anything so harsh that Mary would object. But with persistence, he chipped away at Richard's self-esteem. The hot hatred that Richard had always felt toward Carl grew to a boil. That first year in Santo, Texas was the worst in Richard's life. Carl was relentless with his put-downs, and Mary was resolute in her determination to avoid upsetting her new husband by defending her son. Carl went after Richard's looks, noting that he was strange-looking. Richard didn't talk much and struggled to express himself when called upon. He was easily embarrassed, especially in the company of women. Nobody understood why, and Richard was unwilling to explain why. Carl would keep attacking Richard until Richard would become deeply upset. Richard would skulk around. He fought back tears. The situation came to a head one day when Carl made a disparaging remark about Richard's father. This was the last straw. Richard's feelings and memories of Benjamin was hallowed ground, and Carl had just triggered a landmine. Richard swung at Carl, but not only did the punch not land, but he was so slight he would barely have left a mark behind if he had made contact. Carl laughed at his effort and pushed Richard to the kitchen floor with little resistance. Richard was 10 years old at the time, after all. Carl ridiculed Richard for his lack of strength. Richard only became more determined to hurt Carl. He grabbed a hammer from Carl's toolbox and took a swipe at his skull. Carl slapped the hammer away with a laugh, as if it were a bothersome fly. With minimal effort, his backhand sent the hammer straight back into Richard's skull. Richard was knocked unconscious and fell to the floor. Though Carl would hardly have missed Richard, he knew that he would be the only one to face charges if Richard had died, since it was no secret to anyone that he hated the boy. He knelt and slapped Richard in the face. He shouted, "Wake up!" Richard didn't stir. His eyes had rolled up into his head. He was foaming at the mouth. A pallor crept into his face. He was still breathing, however. He slapped Richard a few more times. He rolled him over on his side when he began to vomit. After a few minutes, Richard opened his eyes. Carl was beyond relieved. He expressed his elation by saying to Richard, "Don't ever try that shit again, or you'll get a lot worse, you hear me?" Richard resented Carl even more now. That was the one thing that remained after his close call with death. He ran from the house, but he would never be able to escape the brain injury he had incurred. If only Carl Lindbergh had been aware of the consequences that would emerge years later. The family would move several more times, and usually resided in one indigent neighborhood after another. Though Mary took it in stride, her children did not. Carl dragged them into circumstances that only got worse with every change of address. Carl continued to abuse Richard. Richard didn't tell his mother what Carl had done, claiming instead that he had fallen from a tire swing. Though the discoloration the blow left behind faded, Richard's anger had not. In fact, containing his rage was becoming more and more difficult. He would lash out at someone for as much as looking at him the wrong way. Carl was the only male role model in the house, which was otherwise run by domineering women. Though he despised Carl, he was influenced by him in some ways. He would consume Carl's leftovers and even steal entire bottles of liquor on some occasions. The family was living in Dallas now. It was one of the city's worst neighborhoods, and there was liquor and drugs everywhere. To escape his feeling of emasculation, he took various narcotics. These substances empowered him with this pride and strength that eluded him while sober. His substance abuse would continue for the years to come. He always managed to scrape together enough money to buy it, and the drug dealers were more than willing to deal with him as he had physically matured into a young man. Though the drugs and alcohol helped to alleviate his inner turmoil, they were detrimental to his scholastic career, as he skipped classes frequently. Things took a turn for the worse in 1955. At the age of 13, he was arrested for the first time. When he was intoxicated, he would break into a partially completed housing project and use it as temporary shelter. He was charged with trespassing. It was his first charge, but it would not be his last. More charges followed throughout the years. Though his criminal activity was not limited to trespassing, he became well known to local police, so much so that if they wanted to find him, they knew to check abandoned houses. There they would likely find him drinking or taking drugs. Though he would attend school at his mother's request, he had little respect for her after choosing to wed Carl. Still, she had a way of controlling him. She could also get him to apologize to somebody. Otherwise, he was bereft of remorse. He repeated grade 8 due to his problem drinking and his fear of public speaking. As the girls he attended school with were blossoming physically, his feelings toward them became fraught with desire and contradiction. He hated and resented their attention, but also yearned for it. These complicated feelings made no sense to him. He would follow girls around and stare at them, but he couldn't bring himself to speak to them. Taking that crucial step would only leave him flushed with embarrassment, and he would run the other way. His body also undermined his ability to score with girls. Acne proliferated due to the unsanitary living conditions in his home. That, in addition to his nutritionally bankrupt diet and a poor genetic pedigree. Pimples and boils would plague him throughout his adolescence. When he emerged in adulthood, several scars and pockmarks remained as mementos. Richard fared worse in high school. He failed all his subjects in grade 9. Facing the prospect of repeating all those classes, he dropped out at the age of 16 and ventured out into the real world, where he would live on his wits to earn a living. Rather than get a legitimate job, he became a career criminal. He committed petty thefts. He got arrested for drunk and disorderly behavior. He was charged with possession of narcotics. It got to the point that police would always visit his house whenever a crime was committed, whether there was evidence that he was the perpetrator or not. When he was interrogated by police, he gave them all the information they wanted. For some reason, it hadn't occurred to him to lie about his crimes, as most offenders would. For 3 years, he continued to live with his mother and stepfather, but spent most of his waking moments on the streets. He sought relief from the tensions he felt at home. It could not be said that Richard merely fell into a bad crowd. Richard was the bad seed. Even other petty criminals didn't like him. It was during this time that he had his forearm tattooed with the words, "Born to raise hell." Richard's hatred of Carl led to his criminal behavior. His mother and his sister Carolyn were unable to deter him from venturing down this path. Carl knew that he was at fault for this change that came over Richard. Also, Richard had grown physically, and Carl wasn't sure he could win if they entered into another altercation. Carl began to spend more and more time away from home. Though he told Mary he was working, he was mostly just committed to alcohol and prostitutes, with insurance sales slipped in between benders. He would disappear for weeks, and eventually, months at a time. At one point, he just couldn't fathom returning to Mary and her brood. When he met another single mother who took a shine to him, this time in California, he leapt at the chance. Carl was finally gone. This action led to a sharp turnaround in Richard's behavior. He began to return home at night and eventually retired from his street life altogether. His presence at home became routine, and it was almost as if nothing had ever happened. He became the man of the house and took responsibility for providing for the family financially. He worked at a 7-Up bottling factory. He was doing the same kind of work his father did. It didn't pay well, but it paid better than his criminal activities. He didn't spend half his money on alcohol and whores, so the family prospered more with Richard as a provider. Their house felt more like a home, without a drunk laid out in the living room all the time. Richard would once again develop incurable resentment. This time it wasn't directed at his stepfather. Mary took him for granted and even treated him dismissively during family discussions. His rage toward the women in his life was on the incline. He felt his mother and sister were not worthy of the treatment to which they felt entitled. He was providing for them financially, and they didn't seem to appreciate him for any reason. Taking a drastic approach to establishing himself as a figure of respect in the household, Richard became physically abusive to his mother. He punched her in the face, leaving her with matching black eyes. Mary didn't call the police, but she did visit her doctor, fearing that Richard broke her cheekbone. This was the first manifestation of Richard's history of violence against women. Richard suffered frequent headaches due to the brain injury Carl inflicted on him. He would medicate with liquor. It didn't medicate the damage that was done to the area of his brain that managed impulse control and emotion. Mary and Carolyn kept their distance when he came home drunk. He never hurt Carolyn. She was sacred to him. Oddly, Mary wasn't as frightened of Richard's rages as Carolyn was. Mary identified hatred and violent tendencies in Richard since he was a small child. She saw whatever respect he had for her wither away after she married Carl. She expected that a confrontation would happen at some point. Carolyn got married and her husband moved in with the family. With him bringing in a second income, the family lived in comfort and they were happier. It also brought Richard relief after a long phase during which he was confused by incestuous desire for Carolyn. Now another man had claimed her, and Richard could sleep easier. It was at this time that a seismic event was to take place. At the Texas State Fair in 1961, he met the woman who would become his wife. Her name was Shirley Annette Malone. He was 20 years old, she was 15. Up to this point, his perspective on sex was two-pronged. His religion depicted sex as being the domain of the tawdry Audreys of the world and its supposed connection to the infernal underworld. He had also suffered the misfortune of bearing witness to the unsightly physical congress of Carl and his mother on a few occasions. Shirley was only 3 years out of childhood and only beginning to blossom into a woman, though remaining a girl. They both sought the approval of their parents to spend the day together. Even her parents didn't think there was anything seedy about a 20-year-old man wanting to spend time alone with a 15-year-old girl. They just thought it was cute. When they parted, they vowed to meet up again. They both lived in Dallas, making this feasible. Due to Richard's inexperience with dating, he didn't know what should transpire during their first outing. So he took her out drinking. With both of their inhibitions diluted by alcohol, he took her to a semi-constructed house for a, quote, lie down. Several more were to follow. Richard finally had a human being as a sexual outlet. She fell in love, and he thought he had as well, though he may have confused lust with something more meaningful. They were both happy with the situation either way, and the 3 weeks they were a couple were the happiest of Richard's life thus far. Indeed, his life was going very well. He had a job, one at which he excelled. His family was Carl-free. He had a girlfriend who entered into their affair a virgin, and they had all the sex he wanted. Unfortunately, it was not to last. One day, when Richard and Shirley made a date, she refused to go to the bars for more pre-coital boozing. Their knowledge about sex was as limited as their understanding of its consequences. She persuaded him to take her somewhere quiet to talk. She revealed to him that she was pregnant. Thanks to this, the purity in her that he had idealized so much had spoiled. In his view, the Madonna had become a whore. When they told their families, the response was uniform on both sides. They were told that they must marry as soon as possible. They felt it must be done before Shirley began to show. Richard and Shirley didn't oppose this, and they were married a few months later. Richard came to relish the idea of starting over. Just as Shirley took his surname, he took his father's back. Richard would once again be Richard Speck, and this time for good. Richard and Shirley Speck lived in his mother's house, and Mary taught Shirley the skills she would need to be an old-school wife and mother. Richard continued to work hard, and even took on additional shifts to ensure he could wipe out all signs of struggle he could. One night, another turning point emerged in his relationship with Shirley. He returned from work disappointed to find that the leftovers from the evening meal had been left to cool and became stale. After he finished eating, he retired to their bedroom. Shirley was asleep. Her stomach had swelled considerably. She was no longer the slender, virginal teenager to whom he lost his virginity. As he saw it, she mutated into a bloated whore. Regardless, he became sexually aroused at the sight of her in that state. He was disgusted with himself. Her newfound curves were evidence that the corruption of her had been complete. He disrobed and climbed on top of her. She woke amid the pressure of his body on top of her. She said, "Not tonight, sweetheart." That was the first time she said no to him. Yet that was all it took to provoke his wrath. He pinned her wrists to the bed with his hands and forced himself into her between her thighs. She struggled to release herself in vain. "The baby," she cried. This elicited no mercy from Richard. To her, the fetus was some kind of symbol of innocence. To Richard, it just branded her as a whore. A filthy, depraved slut who had sex, became pregnant, and attached herself to him like a parasite. Like a leech, she grew larger and larger from her connection to him. Meanwhile, he literally felt like his essence was draining, and he was losing his strength. After all that, he thought, the whore had the nerve to say no to him. The only thing whores were good for was sex, and she was refusing that one thing to him. This was not accepted. He hit her over and over and over until he forced learned helplessness into her, and followed it up by penetrating her between her legs. He hate-fucked her with every thrust. When he came, he rolled her over to her side of the bed, acting like this behavior was the most normal thing he could have done. She was shocked and benumbed. She lay there shuddering from pain and disgust all night. When he got up in the morning, he acted like nothing had happened. Everything in his world was as he felt it should be, so perhaps this feeling of normalcy was to be expected. The incident inserted a wedge between them. She made a habit of refusing his sexual advances and endeavored to remain in his family's company as much as possible. Being so easily embarrassed, he wasn't about to pressure her for sex in front of his mother or Carolyn. Her refusal soured her in his view, and he fell out of love. This made it easy for him to beat and rape her whenever she locked up on him. She came to hate him back, but leaving him was not so simple. Her family wouldn't have taken her back, and she had nowhere else to go. The only support she got was from Mary and Carolyn, and they were dependent upon Richard's financial support. Richard's anger began to consume him, and it affected him in every area of his life. He stopped working extra shifts. Some days he no-showed. This ruined his reputation in the plant, but he didn't care. The headaches returned. He drank alcohol as a remedy, but it was not the cure he was seeking. The more he drank, the more abusive he became towards Shirley. From alcohol, he turned to pills. When the pills were not effective, he mixed the two. He showed up to work less often, and the same was true of his appearances at home. Though Shirley and the family were relieved that they didn't have to put up with him as much, the financial strain became difficult for Carolyn's husband to bear. He was supporting 2 wives, his mother-in-law and himself. They struggled in the face of abject poverty. Richard resumed his habit of sleeping off his benders in partially constructed houses. Once again, he began to run afoul of the law. He got into bar fights on a regular basis. He was enraged and hostile. He couldn't wait for somebody to provoke him so he could vent with his fists. When the police presence in his life became too much to tolerate, he hopped freight trains and rode with the hobos to other towns where he wasn't as well known to local law enforcement. In the next town, he would pass out in the drunk tank or in an alleyway. When he woke up, he'd be reeking of his own bodily waste. His drinking became more frequent as the baby's due date drew near. He lost his job at the 7-Up plant, and he was hard-pressed to find a bartender who would let him run up a tab. At home, Shirley became fed up with the situation. Realizing she would be living in poverty anywhere else, she decided to leave Richard's home. Still, she clung to the idea that the birth of her child would inspire Richard to turn a new leaf and become more responsible. He never did. As she gave birth to their daughter on the 5th of July, 1962, he never turned up. He wasn't even in town. In McKinney, Texas, he became embroiled in yet another bar brawl. Only this time his opponent was so badly injured, he was dispatched to a hospital. Richard served 22 days in jail for disturbing the peace. When he did return home, Shirley and their daughter were not there. He leaned on his family to reveal her new location, but they concealed the information from him. The disappointment Mary and Carolyn felt for him made a deep impact. He quit drinking and was determined to prove that he was above the debauched man he had become. He was also keen to prove it to Shirley, but she was not convinced. He managed to grovel his way back into the 7-Up plant, but he fell back into his old habits, and he was laid off. Anxious to collect as much money as possible so he could strike out on his own, he stole another employee's paycheck on payday. He forged the payee's signature and cashed the check. He expected that the police would drop by to arrest him for this offense, but they never did. Elated that he had gotten away with a crime for a change, he decided to push his luck even further. He broke into a grocery store with designs on stealing all the money in the cash register. All he made off with was $3 and change. He was furious that he took such a huge risk for such a pittance. He drowned his sorrows with a beer he stole from the store and lifted a pack of cigarettes on his way out. Monday morning, Richard turned up at work to find the jig was up. Someone had seen him swipe the other employee's paycheck. Police were waiting for him outside and he was charged with fraud. He assumed the police knew about the burglary and he brought it up in a conversation with them. They didn't know about it until he mentioned it, so he was charged with unlawful entry. At the age of 21, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He emerged from prison unscathed due to his ability to establish himself as a tough guy by bullying those who were weaker. He motivated himself to earn early parole so that he could integrate his daughter Robbie Lynn into his life. He was released January 2nd, 1965. With nowhere else to go, Richard returned to his family's home. Much had changed. Carolyn and her husband got their own place because they were expecting a child. Now it was only Mary and Richard. He found her constant attempts to mother him oppressive. Eventually he was able to turn the tables on her. He leaned on her to provide information on Shirley and Robbie Lynn's whereabouts. He was disappointed by the intel he received. She lived on her own for a while, but eventually met a man and she took up with him. Richard wasn't surprised. To him, Shirley was just another whore, and would continue to live the life of a whore with other men. The paradigm was maintained as he saw it. Before prison, his worldview was distorted by his marriage and his state of overall happiness. Now the shell fell away, and the kernel of misogyny inside of him sprouted perennials once more. In other words, he decided all women were whores, and that they were inferior to him. With the exception of Carolyn, most of the women he had known had betrayed him or let him down in some other way. This grim perspective would color his view of the female gender for years to come. Robbie Lynn was the focus of his existence. He wanted to find her and her mother. He wanted to be the father Robbie Lynn had lacked. He wanted to be Shirley's executioner. He would brag to friends at the bar that the only reason he remained in Texas at all was to hunt Shirley down and gut her like a pig. He never did pursue her, however. He didn't have many advantages to bring to the situation. He didn't have the money to fight a legal battle. The biggest long-term investment he made was in a 17-inch carving knife. He would brandish it if a bartender gave him any static. One night he was blind drunk and stormed out of the bar at 2 a.m. after failing to instigate a few fights. He was still fired up as he prowled the streets, looking for a victim. He found one. A woman was trying to get into her car. He rushed at her, brandishing the knife. Though he didn't know this woman, she was symbolic of everything that was wrong with the world at large. He reasoned that since she was out alone so late at night, she had to be a prostitute. He hated whores, and he wanted to punish her for being one. He didn't just want to punish her for the perceived injustice for which she was responsible. The appropriate sentence, he felt, was torture. Sever her face until all vestiges of beauty were cast aside. She took his breath away, and he wanted to rob her of that power. The self-casted spell he was under was shattered when she screamed. He fumbled with the knife and almost dropped it. Realizing that he would not get away with what he planned to do, he sobered up enough to abort. He would not murder and mutilate this woman. Not then. He was startled that he had actually lost so much control over himself. When he saw that lights were switched on in windows nearby, he fled and ran at top speed. The police caught up with him. He confessed to what he attempted to do, and he was convicted. The woman he harassed didn't even have to testify in court to get him sentenced. On top of serving 6 months for violating parole, he was convicted of aggravated assault and received a sentence of 16 months in prison. He had only been out of prison for 1 week. His bunk hadn't even been reassigned. He had no difficulty falling back into his routine there. The guards and inmates didn't even realize he had been gone. Throughout his incarceration, he bragged to anyone who would listen that he was going to exact revenge on his cheating, baby-stealing whore of a wife. After the first 6 months, everyone in the prison knew her name and her fate, should he locate her after being released. They weren't entirely convinced of his integrity, however. He liked to talk a big game about the crimes he committed and would perpetrate in the future. Not only was he unrepentant, but he felt his rap sheet elevated him in status, both in the prison and on the street. He was released after serving only a fraction of his sentence due to a clerical error that resulted in him being released at the end of his original sentence, that being for 6 months. After he was released, Richard was determined to reform himself. A week after he left prison, he was hired by Patterson Meat Company as a delivery driver. The pay was meager and the job was monotonous, since the proprietors and management knew he was an ex-con. When he was off duty, he frequented Ginny's Lounge, owned by a woman named Ginny, once a professional wrestler with bulging muscles as evidence that she was no pushover. Richard was captivated by her, and she became taken by him. She had been through an acrimonious divorce, and she was drawn to Richard, with his good looks and charisma drawing her to him. She flirted with him enough to ensure he would keep coming back. Richard was hardly a model employee. He crashed the truck numerous times. The company let him get away with that, but they didn't tolerate his increasing absenteeism. It got to the point where he would report to Ginny's Lounge in the morning instead of work. He lost his job and all his disposable income. He did take on the duty of babysitting Ginny's kids, where she lived upstairs. He flirted with Ginny constantly for months, but had not been able to consummate a union with her. Meanwhile, Shirley filed for divorce, which sent Richard into a rage. He saw her as his property. It fed even more into his view that all women were whores, just waiting for any opportunity to cheat on their man. Ginny became a source of frustration to him as well. She continued to flirt with male patrons for tips. The level of their attachment to each other wasn't clear at the time to outsiders. There was a clue, however. On one occasion, Ginny's fingers lingered on one man's hand. However innocuous her intentions may have been, it was enough to trigger Richard's blind, murderous rage. He rushed up to the man, grabbed him by the collar, and flung him to the ground. Ginny screamed Richard's name, pleading for him to withdraw, but the sound barely bled into the amniotic sac of wrath in which the new Richard was incubating. All other sensations and input receded beyond his sphere of comprehension. All he could hear was the jackhammer-like repetitions of his pounding heart. The man tried to stand, but Richard beat him back down. The man kicked Richard, destabilizing him for a moment, but Richard soon re-established his footing. The man attempted to tackle Richard, but unfortunately for him, a knife blocked his path. The floorboards beneath him were drenched with blood. The man's friends intervened, though none of them challenged Richard. They dragged their injured friend away. Once the man's friends got him out on the street, police sirens rang out. Richard's first instinct was not to flee, but to search out the person who called the cops and disembowel them. There Ginny was, standing at the payphone. She stared at him as if he were a complete stranger. She was certainly unfamiliar until that day. With Richard's homicidal evil twin, she didn't recognize him after months of intimacy. The same man who had been entrusted with the care of her children while she was working was splattered with blood. Another man's blood. To her surprise, that Richard Speck disappeared into the ether before her eyes. He was shocked by what he had just done, and a boyish look of awe spread into his face. His anger was diluted by shame, and he dropped his knife, as if the blade itself were a key that unlocked a door to all his worst instincts. They parted for good that day. Richard didn't flee. The police took one look at his blood-soaked clothing and knew they had their man. He was brought in for questioning. Though his fortunes with Ginny turned sour, he wasn't neglected by Lady Luck. Most of his rap sheet listed petty crimes that were often connected to drugs and alcohol. This was different. It was a crime of passion. Another man flirted with his girl, and it set him off. The local police culture could sympathize. His mother hired a lawyer, and with a plea bargain, he received a $10 fine. He refused to pay it, so he spent 3 days in a municipal jail. Easiest time he ever served. When he got out, he returned to his mother's house. She wasn't as welcoming this time. She wanted him out. He assumed it was because she was a whore and wanted to sleep around. She was a woman after all. He didn't dare show up at Ginny's lounge. The woman had tossed him around in the bedroom as if he were a rag doll. He struggled to make money doing odd jobs, but being so unreliable due to his alcohol and drug use didn't help his reputation as an employment prospect. He wanted to get out of his mother's house and the town altogether. One way he could accomplish this was to buy a car. He saved some money and bought a used car on March 5th, 1966. It was a lemon, and he rued his decision. That money could have bought a lot of drugs and alcohol. He had to come up with an idea to make money, fast. He decided to try burglarizing a local store. He drove to it the following day. He took all the money from the till and grabbed as many cartons of cigarettes as he could. With this, he established himself as a reputable dealer of black market cigarettes. He made more money doing this than he ever did doing odd jobs. He came to regret this behavior and he abandoned the car, taking the money with him. If he had thought to remove the car's paperwork from the glove compartment, he would have walked. He spent the night in a partially constructed house on the outskirts of town. It was cold and he was shivering. He didn't stay at his mother's place because that was the most obvious place the police would look. He had alienated just about every other person who had ever been close to him. Everybody except his beloved sister Carolyn. The only woman besides his daughter he didn't consider to be an out-and-out whore. She drove up in her husband's car unannounced. She grabbed him and ushered him out of the house and into the car. Carolyn drove Richard to the bus terminal and bought him a cross-country ticket to Chicago, feeling that the relocation and anonymity would keep him one step ahead of the law. That was the first time they had spoken in years. He was so grateful words couldn't express how thankful he was. She said nothing either. She dispatched him with a kiss on his forehead and shoved him out of the car. His days from one sister to another. Richard's sister Martha picked him up at the bus terminal in Chicago. They hadn't had much contact over the course of Richard's life due to a generational remove. She moved out of the family home when he was still a small child. She was a nurse at the time, but when her husband finished his tour of duty in World War II, he returned home and Martha became a homemaker. Richard and Martha finally had an opportunity to bond. Her husband Gene wasn't nearly as taken with Richard as she was. Richard was unemployed and generally useless. What made Jean really uneasy was the way Richard drank up the sight of his teenage daughters. Richard's appetite for female purity had barely been satiated by Shirley, and his nieces appeared to leave him salivating. Though he didn't spell it out to him explicitly, Jean wished to make it abundantly clear to Richard that he had worn out his welcome. He dropped hints, talking about the future with hopes that Richard had plans for his role in it. Martha and Jean knew that Richard had been in trouble in Dallas. What they had gathered from family gossip was a run of substance abuse, jail time, and an acrimonious divorce. They didn't want to bring it up with Richard because they wanted to maintain peaceful relations with him. They decided that as long as Richard behaved himself, they wouldn't pry into his personal affairs. Richard knew he was not wanted in Jean's home, and it began to nettle him. Jean watched him like a hawk. In their home, Richard was roped into a conventional lifestyle. There was a family dinner at the same time every night, and they retired to bed early. Richard recognized an opportunity to receive the kind of maternal love and care from Martha that only manifested as smothering from his birth mother. He wanted this from Martha badly, but he was also afraid that she would learn that the rumors about his behavior in Dallas were based in truth. With Jean pressing him out the door, he knew that if he didn't leave soon, he would blow it with Martha. The three of them came to an agreement, whereupon he would move to Monmouth, Illinois, where some of his relatives lived. With their support and an opportunity to start his life over, it occurred to him that it was a chance to emulate the hard-working and decent man his father had been. He looked forward to the move, especially since someone among his network of family and friends in Monmouth arranged for him to obtain employment. He took off in yet another bus for another town with different prospects once more. In Monmouth, Richard was picked up by his eldest brother, Howard. Howard drove Richard to the job site. Howard had helped support Mary for years, and now he extended his Midas touch to Richard. He had been a journeyman joiner and now owned his own business. The wages weren't great, and work consisted of repetitive menial labor, but Richard enjoyed working with his hands. Howard's expectations for Richard were low in the beginning, but Richard took to the work like a duck to water and impressed his supervisors. Though there were no complaints at the factory about Richard's performance, Howard was less enthusiastic about the life Richard lived in Monmouth. Richard lived with Howard. Howard didn't object to this arrangement like Jean had. Howard didn't even mind that Richard took all his earnings to the bar. He did feel dread whenever Richard came staggering home in the early morning hours, however. Richard relieved Howard of these concerns when he moved out and resided in the Christie Hotel, which was located in the center of town. He wanted to stay there because it was located near the taverns he frequented. Staying in the hotel was inexpensive, and he intended to stay there until management asked him to leave. He wasn't able to raise money to elevate his standard of living. His new drinking friends encouraged him to go with them on a drinking tour of Gulf Point, Illinois, on the last weekend of that month. They turned up for work on Monday. Richard had not. In one of the bars, Richard's friends were joking and carrying on. One of the locals joined in with this tomfoolery, assuming they were familiar enough with Richard to poke fun at him. He was wrong. Richard confronted the man in the men's room. He dragged him from a urinal, slammed him against the tiles, and held a knife to his throat. Richard's friends entered the room and pulled the two men apart. Though that was the end of the altercation, the man wasn't content to leave it at that. As soon as he was able, he reported Richard to the police. Richard spent the rest of the night behind bars. Richard managed to reach Monmouth Monday afternoon, and he went straight to work. He apologized to management. They had heard about what he had done to the man in the bar. He wasn't fired, but he was given a final warning. If he missed one more day, his employment would be terminated. Richard was given more interesting tasks to complete at the factory, and he even did some carpentry work on the side. Richard's personal conduct at work took a dark turn. Though he came across as half-joking, he provoked his co-workers and threatened them, and it went on long enough that he risked losing his job. Money was a frequent concern, but so was sex. He hadn't done it in months. He hadn't been going on dates with women because he was so openly misogynistic he turned them off. Ultimately, no woman wanted to be told that she was a whore, no matter how promiscuous she might have been in the decade of free love. His anger toward women burned red hot inside of him. He arrived at a crossroads. He could conceal his resentment of women with a facade of a gentleman. There was also the potential that he could plunge into the deepest, blackest depths of his sexist rage. For a time, he stood flat-footed, lacking in direction. Then came the tipping point. Shirley was granted the divorce. The last connection between them was a strip of legal red tape, and now it, too, had been severed. Any hope of rehabilitating his warped view of the feminine sex had been extinguished. The divorce was the final insult. For years, he had been stockpiling the dynamite of resentment and spite, and now Shirley lit the fuse. He was sure now that all women were whores, and beyond redemption. They ruined his life. There always seemed to be a woman making him miserable, and if they were strangers, he still recognized the same characteristics in them that he observed in Shirley and his mother. He wanted to rob all whores of power. If he failed at this objective, they would rule over him together, and this was anathema. Richard set to work on a drinking binge. The average man would leave the bar in an ambulance after imbibing all the alcohol Richard Speck consumed that night. Richard Speck was about to force some of the world's women to compensate him for what they had confiscated from him over the years. Mrs. Virgil Harris was a divorcee in her late 60s. She lived in one of the new houses of the type that the teenaged Richard Speck slept off his drinking benders in while they were under construction. She lived alone and had never so much as heard the name Richard Speck. Hence, she knew nothing about his criminal past. On the 2nd of April, she was babysitting at the house of one of her neighbors. She was listening to the radio and intermittently checked on the baby she was looking after. After the parents returned from their night out, she returned home. Something wasn't right. She lived on a limited fixed income and handled her finances with frugality. To keep her fuel costs down, she kept all her windows closed. That night she was surprised to find herself greeted by a chill when she entered her kitchen through the back door. She paused in the doorway. A man stepped out of the shadows. Moonlight refracted from the blade of his knife. He spoke. "Close the door behind you, please, ma'am." Despite breaking into her home and brandishing a knife, the Caucasian man with his southern drawl was unfailingly polite. His courtesy remained even as he tied her up and blindfolded her. He remained polite as he searched her purse. He stole $2.50, the money she was paid for babysitting. Incredibly, he was still civil to her as he stripped her of her undergarments and raped her. He bid her a respectful word of gratitude and said good night when he left. Mrs. Harris was more bewildered than traumatized at the time. All the robber made off with was her radio, some costume jewelry of little worth, and her babysitting fee. She reported the incident to the police and gave them a description of the assailant, but she didn't get a good look at him, so the police didn't know who to look for. The rape of Mrs. Harris wasn't nearly enough to quell the homicidal rage he harbored against women. He was surprised and dismayed by her advanced age. She just wasn't whore material. He wanted to punish whores. This woman was more maternal, the kind of woman he sought after losing all respect and love for his mother. As a result, he wasn't nearly as vicious to her as he would have been to a woman he would have deemed a whore through and through. He hated this. He hated that he had no control over his self-control that surfaced as he raped and robbed the woman. The rape didn't satisfy him in any way. It wasn't vicious enough. It wasn't aggressive enough. It wasn't violent enough. It wasn't oppressive enough. It wasn't even tawdry enough. Considering the kind of brutality he would become infamous for in the years to come, this episode merely represented a crack in the levee. Soon, however, the floodgates would come crashing down. It didn't take much to provoke Richard at this point. One night, he was drinking in a bar called Frank's Place. The bartender poked fun at him without malice aforethought. He stormed out. He had a history with female bartenders disrespecting him. He simply could not abide that this woman, who had the misfortune of making Richard Speck's acquaintance not only as a woman, but as a woman named Mary, was calling him names. Adding injury to insult, he was unemployed, and it began to sting. Mary's insult was the last straw. He went out back to the pig pen he built for the owner. Pigs were going about their business. They couldn't escape, and it was because his workmanship ensured their secure enclosure. He wasn't just a criminal and a drunkard. He was somebody, and he could do things well. Nobody seemed to notice or care. He decided he no longer needed anybody's approval. Not his brother's, after his brother cut ties with him after his arrest in Gulf Point. Nobody. He contemplated the swine mulling about in their own feces, and became so lost in thought that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind until it was too late. "Richard," a feminine voice said, "what are you doing out here, honey? I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings back there?" It was the bartender who insulted him, Mary Kay Pierce. The timing of her approach couldn't have been worse. She was the sister-in-law of the bar's owner. She was experienced with drunks since she was a teenager. She knew how to manage the bruisers and the broken-hearted. She wasn't prepared for what was about to happen, though. She put an arm around Richard's shoulders. "I'm sorry, buddy. You're one of the good ones. I shouldn't have jibed you." Richard turned to her. His initial reaction was a blank stare, as if she were not a flesh-and-blood human being, but a ceramic decoy, just an object. Richard also had many years of experience in bars. He knew what condescension looked like and sounded like, or at least he thought he did. He thought he recognized it when some whore got it into her mind that she could handle him. He also had many bar brawls under his belt. With his slender profile, he was forced to develop some technique so that larger and stronger men wouldn't make short work of him. As if on autopilot, he punched Mary in the gut. He hit her with so much force, she fell to the ground. He knocked the wind out of her, and she gasped air back into her lungs. She tasted copper in her mouth. Richard hit Mary with surgical precision. He ruptured her liver. She still couldn't breathe, but she managed to whimper when he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the pig pen. He lifted her up and tipped her over the fence. Patrons started leaving the bar because last call had been announced. They passed the alley where he dumped Mary's body into the pig pen. If anybody had turned their head in that direction, he would have been caught. But he wasn't. He got into the pen. He kicked the pigs out of the way as he dragged Mary further into the sty and away from any hope that someone might see her and come to her rescue. The pigs squealed louder, erasing any possibility that anybody would hear her whimpering. Once he found a spot he saw as ideal, he laid her body down and pulled at her muddy clothes. Blood was pooling on her lips. It worked its way up her throat now that she was laid out flat. She swung at him with feeble arms as he forcibly removed her clothing. She knew something inside of her body had been injured, but she would not give her body over to him without a fight. She scratched at his face, but he ducked out of reach. Richard heard human voices. They must have been alerted by the sound of the pigs. There was a commotion. It could have been someone coming out from the bar to investigate. He ran. Mary lay alone in the mud, in the dark that surrounded it. Her arms fell to her sides. She drew in her last blood-curdling breath. It was then that she died, alone, in a pig pen. The murder was first-page news in town the next day, and it was on everybody's mind. Mary was well known in the community and highly regarded. Local police immediately launched an investigation. After questioning suspects, they learned that Richard Speck had been present at the bar that night, but there was not enough evidence to issue a warrant for his arrest. They still had to question him. That was easier said than done. He had no fixed address, and his employment record was checkered with absences, long periods of unemployment, and prison terms. Their last resort was to contact his boss to ask if he had shown up for work. Providing his own assistance, the boss promised Richard he would receive his last paycheck provided he went to the factory to collect it. The next day, Richard picked up his check, but when he left the building, he was greeted by police. They interviewed him in the back of a squad car. They questioned him, but the results were markedly different than what they were used to from him. He didn't confess to anything other than having been at the bar that night. He told them he left early. He was equally evasive when asked other questions. He had done hard time and was no longer intimidated by cops. He hated them and deemed them unworthy of his cooperation. He told them he built the pig pen over a month ago, and that he had no sentimental attachment to Frank's place or any of the staff. He claimed to never have had any conflict with anybody there. He told them it was just one of the many bars he frequented on a regular basis. They took him home, insisting on recording his room number, and asked him if he would stay in town for a few days, in case they needed to ask him more questions. He laughed at this. "Where else am I going to go?" The account Speck gave to the police about the night of Mary's murder presented with a number of discrepancies. He had been drunk after all. He was gone. Left the hotel. The hotel's clerk had nothing useful to say other than he remembered Richard carrying a suitcase full of clothes and informed him he was taking them to the laundromat. After that, he disappeared. The police searched Speck's room. They found numerous items that were reported missing from area homes. The fact that he left town with such haste aroused suspicion. Meanwhile, Richard Speck was far away. He hopped aboard a freight train, and there he remained until he reached his destination, Chicago. Richard turned up at the house of Jean and Martha. They took him in after he fabricated a story about a criminal syndicate in Monmouth that forced him to sell drugs for them. He was persuasive enough to convince them it was the truth, and he remained in their home for a time. Jean worked at night as a railroad switchman, and he was uncomfortable with the prospect of Richard being alone at night with his daughters. After all, he had witnessed Richard leering at them the last time he stayed with them. There was no evidence that Richard would violate his daughters, so he didn't express his concerns to Martha. Instead, his anxieties gnawed away at him while he worked. He decided the best course of action was to find Richard a job and get him out of the house. Pronto. Preferably, he would find him a job whose work site was located very far away from his house and his daughters. Jean may have been put on edge by Richard's presence in his house, but Richard was, by contrast, more at peace than he had been in a long time. From his perspective, in murdering Mary Kay Pierce, he had turned the tables on a woman who had tried to dominate him. It was the first time he felt that he had complete control over his person. He hadn't felt that empowered and calm since the years preceding his father's death. He enjoyed raping women because in the absence of consent, only he had the power. Murdering a woman was completely different, a new kind of pleasure. Nothing else he experienced could compare to it. Killing was carnal for him. It was erotic. He was the master from beginning to end throughout the course of a homicide, and this suited him just fine. Richard's life outside of substance and crime was far from fulfilling. He couldn't connect with Martha as he'd hoped. She had no intentions of mothering him as he'd wanted her to. He was broke, so the bar crawl was prohibited. He couldn't connect with anybody, and loneliness hollowed him out in the spaces that would otherwise have been filled by love and companionship. There was only room left for hatred, misogyny, and the homicidal impulse. He had been marginalized by everybody around him once again, and his pain turned to resentment. His relationship with Jean only worsened. Jean wanted him out of the house. One day while Richard was asleep on the couch, Jean poked him awake. He abandoned the tack of prevaricating with Richard. He wouldn't play games with him anymore. "Get up," Jean said. "I'm taking you out to get work." Richard tried to deflect Jean's effort with his usual litany of excuses, but Jean had had enough of this. "There's steady work on the ships if you're strong enough to handle the work," he said. "Have you got what it takes?" Jean had been in the Navy, and some of his friends had gone to work in the Merchant Navy. The pay was good, and it meant Richard would be far away from his couch and his daughters. It wouldn't put an end to his drinking, but whatever Richard chose to do with his pay in his new life wouldn't affect his family. He had already consulted with his friends to find out how Richard could go about applying for a job. Richard interpreted this as a challenge to his manhood. It turned out to be the ideal psychological tactic. Before long, Richard was off the couch, dressed, and en route with Jean to the offices of the Coast Guard, where Richard would apply for and obtain a letter of authority. Richard's assignment was to work on a boat called the Randall. It was a bulk or lake freighter that stopped in Chicago on its way upriver. It was hard going at first. Though it was not a military mission, the management was as strict and exacting to him as drill instructors are to recruits in the armed forces. Even the interpersonal dynamic of prison didn't compare to what he encountered on the Randall. He didn't get to drink, and he wasn't allowed to cut corners. It wasn't ideal for the unemployed Richard Speck, but this was a different man. He rose to the challenge and became a highly disciplined worker. He improved in every way, growing not only as a hired hand, but also as a human being. Jean and Martha would have been ecstatic. This was the Richard Speck Shirley would have taken back into her bosom if only he hadn't raped and beaten her. His future looked bright. He was heading down a path of lawful behavior and gainful employment. Merchant Navy was about to hand the world the Richard Speck it needed. Just as Richard Speck was on the road to becoming a model citizen, he was about to take a U-turn. On the 3rd of May that year, within days after the boat departed, Richard didn't show up to his shift. The captain dispatched an employee to his quarters to rouse him. Richard was curled in the fetal position on the floor of his cabin. He had such a strong fever he was literally hot to the touch. Though there were no medical personnel on the ship, the crew had enough medical knowledge among them to know that he must have been stricken with some kind of infection. Richard's concentration was impaired, leaving him barely communicative. He was doubled over with pain and only spoke with difficulty. His appendix had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. It was dangerously close to bursting. The crew weren't exactly thrilled by his condition, which they considered an inconvenience, but the ship stopped and they ordered a helicopter to pick Richard up and take him to hospital. Once in St. Joseph's Hospital in Hancock, he was rushed into surgery for an emergency appendectomy. It was as if Richard woke up on a different planet altogether. The drugs he was given in hospital eliminated whatever discomfort he had experienced while going through withdrawal from the narcotics he imbibed in the recent past. Also, after the Randall with its all-male crew removed him from women entirely, he suddenly found himself surrounded by them. This was during the era when nurses still wore white uniforms, and in his condition they looked angelic to him. They were kind and nurturing toward him. They didn't look at him with contempt or malice like the women who had hurt him. He had nothing they wanted to use him for, and they only wanted to help him. He was so moved by this he nearly wept. One such woman sat by his bedside when he came to after the effects of the morphine wore off. Judy Lake Yanyami was a 28-year-old nurse. She was very pretty and equally as kind. Her husband recently filed for divorce, so her patients, on an individual basis, became the sole recipients of her empathy and support. She talked to Richard for long periods of time. He confided in her, telling her about the loneliness he felt. Soon she opened up about her own personal hardships. He didn't expect this kind of treatment from a woman. Judy wasn't pure. She had obviously been intimate with at least one man, but Richard didn't feel this qualified her as a whore. There was nothing whore-like about this woman. He was touched, but baffled by her compassion. She was kind to him with no thought of reward. Above all, she was sincere. He tried in vain to figure out what her agenda was. What was she after? An answer never came. On his last day in hospital, Judy gave him a hug, and he was left in a state of confusion. Do women like Judy truly exist? Richard went back to Martha and Jean's house. After basking in Judy's warmth, the shallow nature of his relationship with Martha only became more sharply defined. Both women had gone into nursing, but he now knew Martha would never mother him as he'd hoped she would. She was not only cold to him, but she distanced herself from him in any way she could. She even resisted having conversations of a personal nature with him. He was the black sheep of the family, and to everyone else it was obvious why she would want to keep him at arm's length. The way Richard saw it, it was the same scenario that played out over and over in his life. He was rejected by another woman who was important to him. It hurt as much as when his mother elevated Carl Lindbergh in importance above him after his father died. As usual, there was a woman in his life making him miserable. They all embarked on a campaign to devalue him as they marginalized him to the hinterlands of their lives. Jean hadn't harassed him to the same degree as Carl, but he was eager to get him out of his life. Richard returned to work on the Randall. He was still smarting from the injuries he incurred from the appendicitis, but he wanted to prove he was as hardworking and tough as everybody else. He also wanted to prove to Jean that he wasn't the layabout he thought he was. He fell back into drinking. It was the only remedy that relieved him of the physical pain that made his waking hours a hell on earth. Due to his inebriation, his work performance suffered. His superiors didn't have him fired, but they didn't go easy on him either. If he could handle his liquor and meet the expectations they had for him as a worker, they would look the other way. If not, he would be penalized. This situation came to a head on June 14th. Richard flew into a drunken rage and threatened one of the officers. He was immediately left ashore. He was terminated without pay. They didn't even arrange for his transportation back to Chicago. Once back in Chicago, he couldn't bring himself to deal with Martha and Jean's disapproval of his recent behavior on the Randall. He secured a space at St. Elmo's, a flophouse. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving the flophouse in the near future and walking back into Martha's house with his tail between his legs once more. He had had enough of that. Instead, he purchased a train ticket to Houghton, Michigan. He was met at the train station in Houghton by Judy. She was smiling. It was the only friendly face he had encountered in weeks. Generous and sympathetic as always, she escorted him to a hostel called Douglas House. From there, they went out for lunch. They got reacquainted, though Richard didn't reveal his reason for his latest stint of unemployment. Judy was uncomfortable about discussing her divorce. Neither of them wanted to dwell on their recent suffering. As a result, their time together was refreshing and left them both feeling better. When it came time for them to part ways, Judy pulled Richard to her for another hug. This was as confusing to him as everything else. What was her modus operandi? Was there an MO? His confusion was exacerbated when she slipped an envelope in his hand before wishing him a safe journey home and good luck with his search for employment. The envelope contained $80 from her savings. She had withdrawn it solely for the purpose of giving him a leg up in his time of crisis and uncertainty. It was all the money she had in her savings account. Adjusted for inflation in 2020 terms, she gave him the equivalent of $638.71. This was even more startling to him. The cot he slept on in St. Elmo's was uncomfortable. His thoughts were causing him just as much unease. Judy was a woman, yet she didn't fit into the Madonna horror paradigm in which he categorized most women. She wasn't pure, but she wasn't evil either. For a man who had a tendency to view human beings in absolutist terms of black and white, he was baffled by this gray area. She still hadn't told him how he could pay her back. She also didn't use the money as payment for the privilege of controlling him or hurting him. It was only used as charity for a man who faced severe disadvantages in the world. He would normally drink this kind of money down to the last drop. He didn't. He felt like he would be letting Judy down if he did. However, the fact that he now feared her disapproval meant that the money she gave him had strings attached. She had clearly stated the reason she was giving him the money, and the expectation was that he couldn't just spend it on anything, certainly not alcohol. He became agitated now. She was controlling him, and he hadn't even seen it coming. He didn't expect that reaction. Judy wouldn't have either. For the last time, Richard darkened Martha and Jean's doorstep. They were not happy to receive him. As always, Jean drove Richard to the Merchant Navy Union's offices to see about getting him rehired. By that time, everybody in the union was aware that Richard was a drunkard who fought with officers. His reputation was tarnished. He went back day after day and was rejected just as often. He was given a berth on the SS Flying Spray, a cargo ship whose destination was South Vietnam. When he arrived at the ship to begin work, he was informed that a seaman with more seniority was notified about Richard's application and received the berth instead. Richard was enraged. He complained about it the entire weekend, to the point that Martha and Jean ran out of patience. They drove him into town and dumped him by the side of the road. His only possessions were contained in a single suitcase. Jean smiled at Richard as he informed him that he was no longer welcome in their home. Just like with Carl, the other man had been conspiring to destroy his life. And behind that man was a woman. After securing a space in a rooming house, he went out for a drink. Judy might not have approved, but he assumed she would understand, given the circumstances. Once again, he was rejected by a woman he expected kindness from. He felt Martha owed it to him to play the part of a surrogate mother. Instead, she chose Jean over him. Richard was family, and he was cast out because Jean didn't appreciate the challenge to his position as alpha male in the house. Richard spent all the money Judy gave him on booze. All the thoughts that troubled him the most ate away at him until last call was issued and he was turned out onto the street. Once he was back in the rooming house, he continued to ruminate over the issues that vexed him most. It was a downward spiral that took him down into the darkest part of his psyche, where his most malevolent instincts were rooted. On the morning of July 12th, Richard woke with an intense headache. After getting dressed, he headed to the hiring hall. There he remained, reeking of liquor. He smarted at any sound that was louder than a whisper. In mid-afternoon, a berth became available in Indiana. Most of the other men had gone home. He persuaded Jean to drive him to the dock. Due to a miscommunication, he missed out on the berth. On the way back to Chicago, Jean lectured Richard on responsibility and critiqued his behavior. He told him he was not always going to give him a ride when he needed one. Richard saw red until Jean dumped him by the side of the road. Not only was Richard without a job, but he was penniless. He also had no home to return to. He left town and searched for housing that was currently under construction, as he had in his youth. He slept in a partially demolished house. The next morning he was visited by Martha. Their conversation was more congenial this time, and she took pity on him, giving him all the money in her purse, $25. He took it out of desperation. He thought of Judy, who had given him money out of a genuine desire to help. Martha was helping him out of guilt. The dichotomy between the two women came completely into focus. Like his mother, Martha was just another whore. He went to the hiring hall again, but it became clear he was never going to be hired again. He neither had the seniority nor the reputation to be reinstated. He walked across town and settled in a rooming house. The space offered him control in a world that seemed to only leave him in a perpetual state of chaos. He soon began the bar crawl. He learned a lesson from his conduct in Monmouth. Don't spend too much time in one bar, because it'll increase the recognition factor. He did notice that some of the same faces would re-emerge at other bars, however. He kept a low profile, but he was still part of the scene. It wasn't just men like Richard making the rounds. Prostitutes abounded, assuming that he would take one of them home before the end of the night. He drank his money away, nursing his last drink and leaning on a jukebox to keep his balance. A woman named Ella Mae Hooper walked up. She was 53 years old and heavily made up. In the dim lights of the bar and at his level of inebriation, she looked attractive enough. She pressed up against him and whispered in his ear. Her routine of luring men was practiced and polished. They left the bar hand in hand. They shared a mutual goal, to squeeze money out of the other. Once he got Ella Mae into his room, he brandished the knife at her and demanded that she hand over her money. Not to be outdone, Ella Mae pulled a .22 caliber revolver out of her purse and pointed it at his head. Richard was not intimidated. He grabbed the gun from her hand, pressed the knife against her neck, and forced her down onto the bed. He followed this up by saying, "I was hoping you'd fight back." What the rape lacked in longevity, it made up for in brutality. Though she was compliant with the knife pointing at her, he still visited violence upon her. He slapped her in the face, over and over and over. He slapped her like he slapped Shirley when she tried to refuse him the sex to which he felt he was entitled. When it was over, he took all the money out of Ella Mae's purse and threw her out. He kept the gun. wasn't enough money to keep him going for more than a day, but he had plans. He would commit a robbery and procure enough money to leave Chicago if he wanted to. He already decided on a location. It was a place populated with women he assumed were soft and weak. These women would give him anything he demanded. He had been watching them for weeks as they went in and out of their rooming house. As Ella May fled to her home to nurse the bruises and open wounds that were occupational hazards for women in her trade, Richard went out for dinner at Kay's Pilot House, just a few blocks away. His attire for the evening was an all-black outfit with a knife on his belt, another knife in his pocket, and a gun tucked into his waistband. After dinner, he went out for drinks at a dive bar called the Shipyard Inn. Along with the cheap booze, it was also reputed among the lowlife of the city for being a place where narcotics could be consumed out in the open. For the first time in his life, he tried heroin. It was sheer bliss. All the pain and confusion that tied his nerves in knots receded. He hadn't felt that calm or lucid in a long time. After 10 p.m., his high began to wear off. Nevertheless, he was still possessed of an elevated mood. He felt focused. He was in control. This was what he had always wanted. He was self-assured. He was to remain in control, no matter what happened when he arrived at 2319 East 100th Street. Richard knocked on the door 4 times. By the time somebody opened the door, he was already flashing his revolver. The light inside blinded him temporarily, but he brought his eyes back into focus. He had expected a petite Filipina student nurse. That is not who he saw. It was Shirley. He was discombobulated because there was no way she could be so young and pretty. She wouldn't look him in the face because he still recognized her. It was Shirley, the woman who caused so much of his anguish, the whore who cast a black pall over his life. He blinked again. With greater clarity, Richard saw that Corazon Amaral bore no resemblance to Shirley. She was an entire head shorter. Her physique was dissimilar, and her ethnicity was strikingly different. He had been hallucinating. She wasn't looking him in the eye because she was staring directly into his gun. Still, he was in control. Inwardly, he was screaming with rage. Outwardly, he directed all external stressors. He took a step forward and grabbed Corazon by her forearm. He pushed her back into the hallway. He smiled at her. He was outwardly calm. "Where are your companions?" he asked her. Doors lined the corridor behind her. There could have been a girl just as attractive or more so behind every one. He had decided that they were all whores, and he stood in a whorehouse. They dressed up in their nursing uniforms and resembled women of purity. But to Richard Speck, they were tainted, whores who had been fucked into filth. One of the girls came out of her room. She was clad not in a nurse's uniform, but in a nightgown. The clothes didn't matter. Somehow he recognized her. He pointed his gun at Merlita's face. All the color drained out of it. He waved the gun and herded them down the hallway toward the bedroom at the end. He heard snoring from some of the rooms. There were 8 more girls. Without a pause, he pushed Cora and Merlita through the door at the end. There were 3 girls sleeping in there. Now he had assembled 5 girls. Just as he calculated their numbers, another stepped out of the bathroom by his side. She gasped. He grabbed her by her hair and tossed her into the bedroom at the end. Along the way, he knocked Merlita and Cora off their feet. 6 now. 2 remained out of his sight. He looked back at the corridor. He listened carefully but didn't detect any more motion in the house. He looked back to the bedroom and found that 3 of the girls had vanished. His heart pounded. If they escaped, he would be in deep trouble. The closet door moved. They were hiding. 3 grown women hiding like little girls, hoping he wouldn't find them. He rolled his eyes in the direction of the 3 women who were not hidden. He grabbed Pamela by the waist as she climbed down from the top of the bunk beds, and he dragged her forward. He made an effort to calm her. "It's all right. Calm it down. I ain't here to hurt nobody." Miraculously, this worked. His soft voice and fair features undercut any attempt he made to be intimidating. "Get them out here, would you?" he said. He let go of Pamela, who walked over to the closet. She looked back at him intermittently, terrified. The other 2 girls remained in their bunks. Richard kept his gun pointed at them. The other 3 girls emerged from the cupboard one by one, all dressed in nightgowns. So young, so weak. Richard was almost overtaken by arousal, but he resisted it. It wasn't time for that yet. There were other tasks to complete. At gunpoint, he ordered them to sit on the floor in a semicircle. "Sit down," he said. "Take it easy. Sit down." Part of him was impatient. It was the side of him that wanted to rape them, slaughter them, and revel in the power he had to carry out those plans. For now, that would be put on hold. He crouched down beside them and explained himself. "I ain't gonna hurt anybody. I'm going to New Orleans. I just want some money." Nina and Pam hadn't been touched by him, so they were not as intimidated. "Can we go and get our purses?" "One at a time, and if I even think you're fooling around, I've got all your friends here waiting to pay for it." It was the first threat he issued. He said it with such a laid-back, casual tone of voice that the message conveyed only sunk in once they carried out his directive. The girls left the room and returned with their purses. They resumed their positions in the semicircle. Richard took the cash with an ironically rueful smile, like he was accepting charity. It was strange to them that he was so calm and inoffensive. It was dreamlike, and it was dreamlike for Richard as well. He had all these women at his mercy. He had dreamed of it, and now the fantasy had come to fruition. He didn't feel any fear thanks to the afterglow of the heroin. He turned to the girls with a big smile on his face. He wet his lips. He was about to issue a command when the front door of the townhouse burst open. Gloria Davy staggered inside. She was blind drunk after a date with her boyfriend. She dragged herself down to the room at the end of the hall. When she walked inside, she screamed at what she saw. She tried to leave, but Richard lunged out and grabbed her. He dragged her into the room and planted her on the floor. He was taken aback at how easy this was for him. He had the ideal instincts for femicidal violence. He kicked the door shut and walked to the nearest bed. He stripped it of its sheet and drew a knife. The girls gasped at the sight of it, though they were frozen to the spot with fear. This played into what he considered to be the mentality of a whore. They weren't powerful at all. When they met a man like him, a real man, a powerful man, cowardice undercut any efforts to take him down. That's what he deemed to be the truth of whores. He sliced the sheets into strips, but then watched him with interest, desperate to know what he had in store for them, so that there must be a way to plan an escape. As if reading their minds, he said, "I can't have you all running off and getting the police the minute I leave, so I'm just going to tie you up. Don't worry, I'll be gentle with you." He ruminated for a moment. He wondered why whores always believed him when he said he'd be gentle. If men really were gentle, women would use up every one of them, moving from one sucker to the next. And yet, in consensual sex, it wasn't gentility they found arousing in a man. One by one he took a hold of the girls and bound their legs with ragged strips of cloth. After this he meticulously tied their wrists together. Though they were all terrified, they believed his promise to be gentle. They truly accepted that all he was after was some money, and then he'd leave. They were tied up, but he didn't leave. He didn't say a word either. They were still petrified. Pamela was the last to be bound. This was no accident of fate. He had special plans for her. He said to nobody in particular, "I just want to talk to her. That's all. I just want to talk to her alone." Pamela whimpered. The backs of her thighs were aching from friction burn. Still, she didn't cry out and she didn't fight back. He took her to her bedroom. He loomed over her. She still didn't resist him. She lay there in hopes that if she waited and let him do whatever it was he wanted to do, he would leave her alone soon after. He wondered what juncture in a whore's life it was when she became so stupid. They sure couldn't outsmart him at that point in his life. He drew his hunting knife from his sheath on his belt. Even then, Pamela didn't scream for help. They were situated in the middle of row houses. All she had to do to draw attention to what was happening was to advertise her weakness by screaming. Some man might save them, he reasoned. So far, nothing. The way he saw it, everything he would do to them that evening was well deserved. They were tarnished by their own pride. parading around in high heels and short skirts, giving the cold shoulder to any man who expressed his appreciation with a whistle. Why couldn't they have been good? Why couldn't they have opted for purity? Kind and pure, what was wrong with that? He knew such women existed, but their standard was the one by which these girls were judged by him. Somehow he wasn't cognizant of the knife in his hand as he crouched down over her. His pulse quickened as he laid his hand on her bare leg to draw her closer to him. Just then the front door slammed open. Mary Ann and Suzanne came home from a shift. They were exhausted but giggling. Their mood changed markedly when they got to the back of the house and saw a man brandishing a knife over Pamela's body. They screamed and fled to other parts of the house. They ran to the room at the end of the hallway and screamed when they found their friends bound and arrayed across the floor. A strong hand appeared over Suzanne's face. An arm encircled Mary Ann. Richard hauled them both out into the hall. His grip on Mary Ann was still pending, however, since he was holding the knife. They heard screams in the bedroom. They begged Richard not to hurt the two girls. They begged Suzanne and Mary Ann not to fight back. Richard led them down the hall and brought them into a bedroom. They squirmed, but he still held a firm grip on them. His grip on Suzanne's face was locked. He pinned her mouth and nose shut. He tried to fend off Mary Ann's effort to break free. She was the first to fight back. He saw this as a valid opportunity to cut loose. He plunged the knife into her stomach. He was delighted to feel her warm blood wash over his knuckles. The pre-coital warmth between a woman's legs didn't compare with this warmth. What's more, he created this hole. All the control needed to produce that sensation was his alone. None of the tricks of the trade the whores in his life had employed for his benefit compared to the gasp that burst out of her when she realized her time on this planet was up. And to think it was all because of him. That was how powerful he was. The ratio of power to the powerless was 100-0 after he was through with her. Suzanne still clawed at his hand in a fruitless effort to overpower him. He dropped the knife on Mary Ann. He collapsed on Suzanne with his arms outstretched, like Jesus, only it was a whore dying for the sins of all other whores. Still on top of her, he pinned her to an unmade bed and grabbed her throat. He challenged her. That's it. Fight me. Do it. Suzanne tried with all her strength to push him off, with every part of her body. She even tried biting his fingers where they were stretched over her lips. Nothing worked. She wrung all the strength out of herself. She hadn't drawn breath in a full minute, and her lungs were burning. As her struggling ebbed to nothing, Richard took his hand from her face and matched the other as he squeezed her throat. Not only did he close off her oxygen supply, but he crushed the soft tissues. He could feel the smallest part of her neck coming together as he ground them together with his hands. She stopped breathing. Soon after, she stopped moving. He continued to squeeze. He'd seen men choked in bar fights. He was schooled in how long you had to suffocate a person before they would asphyxiate and die. It wasn't like the movies. It took much, much longer. Once he was sure of their demise, he cleaned his knife off on their clothes. He placed it back into his sheath and went to the bathroom to wash up. The girls in the back bedroom had no idea that Mary Ann and Suzanne were dead. He was glad. He wanted them to be surprised by their fate. The rush from the murders wore off. It was a new drug, and one he was very fond of. But just like any other addictive substance, the fix was pleasurable but fleeting. He had decisions to make. There were still 6 nurses left. He looked in the mirror in the bathroom and found himself talking as if on autopilot. Keep them calm. Keep things easy. Enjoy yourself. Pamela was still alone in her bedroom. She was still crippled by her fear of him. He immediately lost all carnal interest in her. The girls who had fight in them were more appealing to him. This girl was a spent force, and crying. The perfect victim. But that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to rob women of power. This girl sacrificed it in toto. He wasn't about to waste the opportunity presented before him. He rolled her onto her back with a kick. He straddled her waist. He felt her bound hands twitching against the underside of his erection. He ground against her. She was pathetic, he thought. He made no effort to conceal the knife as he brought it up. He also had no intention of giving her a clean, instantaneous death like with Marianne. This woman was laid out before him, and at least for the time being, there would be no consequences to his actions. His connection to reality was severed. This was his world, and he ruled over it like a god. King Richard would have his way. He put the tip of the knife on Pamela's chest and pushed it down slowly. He applied pressure where he felt the resistance from her skin. He forced the blade through layers of muscle and adipose tissue. The knife scraped against her ribs. Once he made his way past this obstacle, he plunged it into her heart. He pumped the knife in and out a few times, just because he loved the tactile sensation of it. There was no rush when Pamela died. She didn't struggle at all. It was too easy. There was no power to draw from her. He stabbed her a few more times. He tied one of her white stockings around her throat for the ornamental appeal of it. He visited the bathroom again. Blood sprayed out of Pamela's arteries and spat all over his torso when she could not. He re-entered the room at the end of the hall. The girls tried to crawl away from him when he walked in. That was just fine with him. They moved like worms, and they were worms, in his opinion. He felt it was only right that they fear him. They had every reason to. After browsing through the merchandise for a moment, his eyes fell on Nina. He untied her legs so that he wouldn't have to drag her around. To the rest of the girls he said, "I just want to talk to her right now. Not the rest of you, just her, all right?" Whatever trust they felt toward him turned to terror after what he had done to the girls who came in late. They didn't believe him when he told them he wouldn't hurt them. It didn't matter to him. He had total control over the situation. His actions were not indicative of a remorseful and empathetic temperament. They did have some influence over the situation, however. If they were calm, he stayed calm. If they became manic, he would too. Richard Speck in a manic state was the last thing they needed. He tugged on Nina's hair, but she followed him dutifully out of the rear bedroom and down the hall to one of the empty rooms. He made an attempt to assuage her fear. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Just lie yourself down." Nina did her best to calm herself down, but her best wasn't good enough. She was trembling from head to toe. He laid her down on the bed, and she was shaking so much it made the mattress's springs squeak. He leaned over her. He was smiling. It was a reassuring smile. Somehow, she was persuaded that everything would be all right, that aside from being raped, she would probably survive the ordeal. She was mistaken. He pushed a pillow down on her face. The illusion broken, she summoned all the energy inside her and countered his strength with hers. She managed to land a couple of slaps on his face with her hands, still bound. Richard didn't feel any pain where she struck him. He did feel heat rising from those areas. She was fighting off his attempts to choke her. He grabbed the pillow and threw it aside. He pounded the knife into her neck. It wasn't efficient enough to dispatch her right away. He missed her arteries and cut into her throat. She gurgled and choked on her blood while still trying to push him off. Nothing could save her now, but she wouldn't accept that. He stabbed her neck over and over. He pulled up her nightdress so that he could see her bare breasts heave as she choked and sputtered out blood. She was considerably weakened at this point, but he let her push him back. It was just another demonstration of how powerless she was against him. He stepped off the bed and walked backwards toward the door. She humped and heaved on the bed, struggling as if someone were still prevailing upon her. She let out a gasp, gurgling as she did so. Blood sprayed from the top half of the bed from her lips. Then she settled down. She lay still. She had choked on her own blood. Richard took a closer look at her inanimate body as he cleaned his knife. He prodded her a couple of times to ensure she was dead. She was. He went to the bathroom to clean some of Nina's blood off him. When he went back to the rear bedroom, the girls were crying hysterically. The girls had originally thought he was just there to rob them, but now they were paying him in blood. This was the life of Richard Speck's dreams. He felt this was as things should have always been for him. Complete power over women. Women cowering in fear before him as he surveyed all he had wrought with pride. He could do whatever he wanted to them. If the world at large were to learn of this incident, it would teach all of its horrors a lesson, he felt. This was a whore's house, and they'd all recognize that as fact. He did it for the men of the world, too. They would examine his actions and finally understand that they didn't need to be slaves to the whores. Men could overcome the power the whores had over them. Their desperate lust for the slippery orifice between a whore's legs would be displaced by the kinds of holes only a knife could make. When he returned to the bedroom, he laughed. The girls had tried climbing under their beds to hide. Corazon's head was wedged between the metal of the bed frame and the carpet. She whined from fright. He grabbed her ankle and yanked at her in an effort to pull her out. It only made her cry louder. Valentina's turn was next. He didn't untie her legs. She was a petite woman of less than 100 pounds. While they were out of the room, Corazon racked her brain for a strategy to escape. She recognized symptoms of drug withdrawal in Richard. She dealt with drug addicts at the hospital where she worked. She knew the signs: his expanded pupils, the pallid skin, the perspiration. Even if the climax of his high had worn off, the substance was still in his system. His perception must be altered. She felt that if she could escape his view, he would pass her by. She was determined to do anything to survive. She moved to America aboard a stinking tanker ship all the way from the Philippines. She came from halfway across the world for a better life, and she was determined to live it. She felt like her skull was being crushed by the pressure, but she pulled it out from between the bed frame and the floor. She heard Valentina cry out. She paused. She writhed around, trying to free herself of the restraints. She paused again when she heard water running in the bathroom. He washed his hands clean of the girls, one after another. The next to die was Merlita. She was an exchange student and also from the Philippines. She came to America to work in the medical field. Unlike Richard Speck, she wanted to save lives. Richard grabbed Merlita by her wrists, still bound, and pulled her body off the floor. He held her aloft. Her feet dangled beneath her as if she were a child's toy. That's all they were to Richard Speck, playthings. Corazon wriggled back under a bed. This time she didn't get stuck. She shifted backward until she hit the wall. She heard Merlita's voice from the other room. She heard the phrase, masakit, which is Tagalog for, it hurts. Corazon heard the water running in the bathroom a few minutes later. The next victim was Pat Matusik. Richard was looking forward to this. She was muscular, at 150 pounds. If she fought back, he stood to rob her of an enormous amount of power. She was the first of all the women in the house to attract his attention as he sized them all up. It was mostly for the chance to get his hands on her. She was strong, but he would prove he was stronger. He was more powerful too, and would do whatever he wanted to her. He used most of the bedrooms up, so he took Pat to the bathroom. His arousal was met by exhaustion. The heroin and the rush from the murders drained him of most of his strength. Once he had her in the bathroom, he asked her, "Are you the girl in the yellow dress?" It was an outfit he had seen her in once. She said nothing. He probed, "Are you?" He stumbled in her direction. She caught the edge of the sink behind her, otherwise she would have fallen to the floor. His vision was failing him. For the second time that night, it looked like Shirley was looking back at him. Then the bitch bartender he fucked and babysat for. His mother. Martha. He felt all the women in his life looking down on him at once. Pat looked at him with disgust. Her lip twisted up. Her hatred for him was smeared all over her face. She clearly thought she was better than him. Like all whores. He punched her in the gut. He punched her the same way he had Mary Kay Pierce. Methodically. Pat fell to the floor. She was curled up, vomiting and twitching, as her liver released the toxins that would kill her. Her face went pale. With this, she resembled Judy more than his mother. It felt like he had killed Judy, the one good woman on this planet who had been kind to him with no expectation of recompense. He looked in the mirror and muttered to himself, "It isn't her." When he looked back down, he saw that it definitely was not Judy down there. It was just another whore. For that, she deserved nothing less than death. He washed blood from his hands and walked back to the rear bedroom. There was one whore left. As he saw her, she was the vilest, the most whorish of them all. He dumped her on a bottom bunk after she came in earlier in the evening, stinking of liquor and men. He figured she had just come back from selling herself to whomever had the money to buy. To aggravate him further, she fell asleep while he killed the rest of them. He'd burned through 7 women. He'd made short work of them, no matter how hard they'd fought. And now he was about to dispatch the worst whore of all. He tore her dress open. The buttons landed on the floor. Some landed as far away as Corazon, where she lay under the bed. She watched in horror as Richard Speck stripped her friend of her clothing. Gloria's underwear required extra effort, so he cut it off with his knife. Corazon was tempted to close her eyes, cover her ears, and pretend it wasn't happening. Instead, she was so paralyzed with fear, she watched as Richard mounted Gloria. Gloria was unconscious from her drunken stupor, while Speck raped her. Not for long, though. When he thrust it into her with more and more aggression, she woke and started screaming. She tried pulling her legs together and bat him away. He pressed his knife to her neck and kept pounding his way into her. His face moved in closer to hers. He grinned. He leaned so close to Gloria that Corazon feared he would see her hiding under the bed. She didn't move for fear that he would hear her. Nevertheless, all it would take was a glance in her direction, and she was done for. Richard plowed with greater speed and ferocity. Gloria's head lolled to the side as tears rolled down her face. It seemed that Gloria had found a way to dissociate herself from the experience. It was her only means of escape. Corazon envied Gloria's ability to do that. Richard howled as he climaxed. During this distraction, Corazon moved back closer to the wall and closed her eyes. If he knew she was there, she couldn't bear to think about it. She was worried that fear alone would cause her to cry out. She pulled her lips between her teeth and bit down until they bled. She remained there until he was finished. Grunting from the effort, Richard rolled off Gloria and tucked his penis back into his pants. He was becoming flaccid. That was what he had built up to all night, and now he was spent. He rose to his feet and grabbed Gloria's ankle bindings. He pulled her, dragging her through the hallway, as if she were a chaise lounge. She was so far gone in her own head, she didn't even complain. Once in the living room, he draped her over one of the seats. He admired her for a moment. She was the type who would never have given him a chance when consent factored into it, but there she was, vulnerable to him. He could do whatever he wanted with her body. He cupped one of her breasts. He passed his hands and gaze up the entire length of her body. All the appeal she held for him disappeared, however. He now saw her as just another whore to dispose of. He had a spare length of torn cloth in his belt. He wrapped it around Gloria's neck. This was his first time strangling a woman with a ligature. He didn't know if it would make the task easier or harder. He twisted it around her neck with all his strength. He pulled it tighter and tighter. So tight, it began to cut into his hands. Her body jerked a few times involuntarily. There was no more fight left in her. Death was upon her even before he decided to strangle all the life out of her. This was the greatest night of Richard Speck's life, and now it was over. He washed himself one last time in the bathroom, careful not to step on Pat. On his way out, he paused at the front door. Last count. 8 nurses lived there, 8 nurses murdered. His work was complete, and for the whores of the world, it would be long remembered. He walked out the front door. In his wake, the house was silent, like a tomb. At 5 a.m., student Judy Dykton woke up to do some extra studying before an exam when she was distracted by the sound of crying outdoors. She opened her window and saw that, across the road, Corazon was perched on a window ledge overlooking the street. She was sobbing. This was chilling to Judy because she knew Corazon and knew she wasn't the type to be so openly emotional in public. Judy rushed across the street to offer her assistance. Still crying, Corazon said, "They're all dead. Oh my God, they're all dead." Judy only had to enter the house by the front door to see that the source of Corazon's distress was no delusion. Gloria lay naked and spread-eagled across a sofa with a cord wrapped around her neck. Gloria had turned blue. Without delay, Judy ran back to her own house and woke all the other students. The students and the house mother went over to the house Corazon was staying in. They were about to step inside when Corazon blocked their passage. "No," she shouted. "Don't go in. He might still be in there. Don't go. Everyone on the sampan has been killed. Everyone." The house mother, Mrs. Bissone, wasn't convinced. She'd been a house mother for years and endured practical jokes and nervous breakdowns. She had to see this for herself. They walked through the house. Mrs. Bissone uttered each victim's name, but elicited no responses. She got on the phone to the hospital. "All of my girls have been murdered." The receptionist asked her, "Who has been killed?" "I don't know. I need help," she said. She hung up and ran outside, where she vomited. It was now up to the girls to call the police, while they were edging closer to hysteria. Officer Daniel Kelly had only been on the force for a year and a half. He had never seen anything like the scene in that rooming house. Once he got a look at Gloria's body, he rushed back out. He knew Gloria. He had dated her sister. He could hear Gloria's voice in his head as he viewed her naked body, raped and strangled, stretched out on the sofa and turning purple. Before he left, he searched the rest of the house to see if the perpetrator was still there. He was not. After his search, he returned to his cruiser and requested immediate assistance over the radio. "They are dead. They're all dead. Oh God, give me the sergeant. I dated her sister. Oh God, I've never seen anything like this." A hardened crime reporter, Joe Cummings, surveyed the scene and also became startled by what he had seen. Oh my God, he was heard to say. By the time reinforcements arrived, Joe was vomiting in the bushes. The officers laughed at him. They didn't expect to be disturbed after having been to so many murder scenes over the years. Joe shook his head at them. They would see how serious it was. As Joe called the story in, the officers left the house and added to the river of puke. The police were on the move looking for a suspect. Cora had given a description of Richard Speck. It was up to investigators to find the name. A gas station attendant who had been asked by Speck to hold his bag one day remembered him, but he also didn't know his name. What he did remember was Speck complaining about missing out on a sailing job due to a double booking. Their next move was to visit the union's offices at the hiring hall. One union member recalled a blonde-haired man, but he didn't understand anything he said because he had a thick southern accent. He also didn't remember his name. The police hit pay dirt when the paperwork from the double booking was unearthed from a garbage can. When Richard Speck applied for his letter of authority from the Coast Guard, he gave fingerprints, posed for a photograph, and a physical description was recorded. His description matched Corazon's, and the prints found at the scene matched his. Within hours, they had found the killer. Their next challenge was finding him. Richard went to the Shipyard Inn after his killing spree. There he washed himself off in a communal bathroom and retired to bed. The next morning he was still in a joyous mood. With all the money he stole from his victims, he met his drinking buddies at Pete's Tap at 10:30 a.m. He was uncharacteristically generous and flush with cash. They weren't used to this at all. Richard and his drinking buddies continued the bar crawl, later ending up at the Sokograd. They heard about the massacre on the news. He deflected their attention from it by saying, "Must have been some dirty motherfucker that done it." He then bragged about a hooker he brought home to his room, who had such a good time she didn't charge him. Richard took one of his friends back to the Shipyard Inn to sleep off his drunken stupor. Richard headed back to the bar because he had a phone call. It was Jean. The union had a berth for him. All he had to do was go pick it up. Richard was excited about this. The entire Chicago police force were going to comb the streets looking for the killer, and this gave him a chance to escape. He had money, though he knew he would drink it away. He had questions, though. The union didn't call you up to offer you work. He also couldn't picture Jean hanging around the hall for him. He called into the union and asked about the position. He was informed that there was a berth on the Sinclair Great Lakes. All he had to do was go to the hiring hall and pick up the papers. He and his friend Red called for a taxi. While Richard played pool in back of the bar, 3 plainclothes policemen came in, asking about a tall blonde man with a southern accent. Unwilling to give up one of his best customers, the bartender denied that such a man had darkened his door. Richard moved to another flophouse called the Raleigh Hotel. He spent the first night with a prostitute. She warned the girl at the counter on the way out that her John had a gun. The police came and confiscated the gun from him, but they didn't identify him as the man who committed the murders at the nurse's house. Details of the killings hadn't been distributed to the police at large, so there wasn't enough information to nail him. They interrogated Red, but he wouldn't give up his friend. Richard moved to the Star Hotel. His timing was good. The police went to the Raleigh Hotel. The girl behind the counter confirmed he was the man they were looking for. His next move was to take a freight train out of town. He even befriended a couple of hobos who had similar plans. They had a bad feeling about him, however, and ditched him. Disappointed, Richard pawned some of his belongings for drinking money. When he went to a liquor store, he froze. His face was on the front pages of every newspaper. On all of them, his face stared back at him, with a caption bearing his name. He had always vowed to himself that he would raise hell, but now that he had done it, he was petrified of the consequences. Back at the hotel, Richard drank a bottle of wine. He smashed the bottle on the frame of his cot and slashed his wrists all the way up to his elbows. He collapsed on the concrete floor. Soon an ambulance took him to Cook County Hospital, the same hospital where his victims were being autopsied. This time he didn't wake to the image of an angelic nurse like Judy. There were bandages over his wrists, and over the bandages were handcuffs. The doctor who treated him recognized the Born to Raise Hell tattoo and called him into the police. They were dispatched to the hospital while Speck underwent surgery for a severed artery. The prosecuting attorney and a few detectives brought Corazon to Richard Speck's hospital room to confirm if he was the man who had killed her roommates. "It's really him," she said. Then she collapsed into the arms of the attorney and the detectives. Speck denied he even remembered the events in question. However, in a confused state, before his surgery, he discussed the details of the murders with one of the doctors. Speck's public defender was no slouch. His name was Gerald Getty. He had crucial articles of evidence excluded. He proved that Richard's pistol was seized in an illegal search. He proved that the prostitute's recollection was suspect. The bloody t-shirts that were found might have been stained when one of the investigating officers snagged himself on the case. The witnesses who had known Richard and testified against him were alcoholics, and therefore their word was called into question. He also argued that it was impossible for Speck to have a fair trial in Chicago, where he became a household name and was labeled a murderer before the trial had even begun. His coup de grace came when he asserted that each witness would be influenced by the others. If this motion carried, 8 different trials would have to be arranged, containing juries with little to no knowledge of Richard's prior convictions. This was impossible. If it had been allowed by the judge, a mistrial would have been declared and Richard would have walked. That was out of the question. Judge Pation decided that the trial would be relocated to Peoria, but all 8 murder charges would be tried there. Meanwhile, Getty consulted with psychiatrists to see if Richard was clinically insane and could not be considered responsible for his actions on the night of the murders. The doctors concluded that Speck's brain was malformed due to the injury Carl had given him. The regions governing emotional control were compromised, and the line between rational and irrational thoughts was blurred. It wasn't enough to prove that he couldn't stand trial. His diagnosis as a sociopath also wasn't enough. One doctor did take note of Speck's obsession with the Madonna whore complex. Richard said once he saw the nurses, he couldn't help himself. The trial resumed. Getty had done an effective job at questioning all evidence, but Corazon was a witness who could not be discounted. After giving her testimony, she walked down from the witness box and pointed at Richard Speck, saying, "This is the man." Initially sentenced to death, the jurors were people who held religious or moral views that opposed capital punishment. Speck was later resentenced, a minimum of 400 years in prison. He served his time in Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. A couple of sparrows flew into his cell, and he nursed one of them back to health after it broke its wing. This gave him an opportunity to have power over another living thing, though without the intention of inflicting punishment. The warden informed him one day that his possession of the birds was in violation of the prison's rules. Richard's response: he threw them into a fan. Blood splattered all over the room. He ignored the rules frequently. What could they do to him? Add more years to his sentence? He was already a lifer. Richard spent all of his time getting high. He consumed illicit moonshine and smuggled drugs. He used his fame to get freebies when he could. He refused most media requests, but gave a single interview to a columnist for the Chicago Tribune. In this interview, he admitted to the murders. He said he had no feelings about the deaths, and that he couldn't even remember them. He described that behavior as freakish. He finished by saying that the hatred the families of the murdered women and the American public felt for him kept him going. To quote Speck, "Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know it keeps up their morale, and I don't know what I'd do without it." Speck's stardom faded off after a few years, as other serial killers overshadowed him, and he disappeared from the public eye. A date has never been given, but at some point, Richard Speck emerged in the public eye once again, when it became known that he was prostituting himself for drugs and booze in prison. His satisfied customers smuggled hormones for him. He grew breasts and wore silk panties when he serviced other inmates. After charging the world's women with whoredom, he began whoring himself. A video of these activities emerged, disseminated by an amateur journalist from within the prison, whose name has never been disclosed. It was aired during a segment of the A&E program Investigative Reports. In the video, Speck can be seen dancing in his underwear, snorting cocaine, performing fellatio on his client, and bragging to the camera about the murders. Someone asked him about how he felt about his time in prison. He said, "If they knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." On the day of December 5th, 1991, just a day shy of his 50th birthday, Richard Speck died of a heart attack after a lifetime of substance abuse. On that video that surfaced in 1996, he was asked why he killed and raped the women as opposed to just robbing them. He simply said, "It just wasn't their night." I'm going to close with a song by another serial killer who had a warped view on women. The song is called "Look at Your Game, Girl." The songwriter is Charles Manson. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. This is Morgan Rector. Bye for now.
There's a time for living. The time keeps on flying. Think you're loving, baby, and all you're doing is crying. Can you feel? Are those feelings real? Look at your game, girl. Look at your game, girl. What a mad delusion, living in that confusion, frustration and doubt. Can you ever live without the game? The sad, sad game. Just to say your love's not enough. If you can't be true, you can tell those lies, baby, but you're only fooling you. Can you feel? Are those feelings real? Look at your game, girl. Oh, look at your game, girl. If you can't feel, and the feelings ain't real, then you better stop trying, or you're gonna play crying. Stop trying, or you're gonna play crying. That's the game. Sad, sad game.